How about it for David Katz? Hi, David. Thank you for your
Having
patience.
a hell of a week. Take a look at what arrived in the mail.
Look at that. Look at that. Well
Your
done,
health
sir.
and Kim's.
Oh, that's so great. I'm glad you received it. We're so grateful for your insight. Hey, can I start with the Supreme Court? This just came down. They essentially upheld the Voting Rights Act and turned back the Alabama Republican redistricting. I mention it. You don't have to get too much into the weeds on it, but I mention it, and then I'll get to the Trump stuff. Only because, is it something of a surprise? I mean, that it didn't quite fall along partisan lines, this ruling?
It was very much a surprise, and I would say it's very good news because Kavanaugh went with Roberts and made a 5-4 majority. If Kavanaugh is going to keep doing that with Roberts, this may even have an impact on the affirmative action case, Mark, which a lot of people think is going to be gutted and changed a lot. Universities and many other institutions are already making plans because they're expecting affirmative action to be gutted or diminished. It may be that with Kavanaugh's vote, now that might be ironic that Roberts might be the one who makes it 5-4 to go back on affirmative action. But it's quite a significant development, Mark, that Kavanaugh is voting in this way. Because Shelby v. Holder was the famous case which cut back on the Voting Rights Act. It used to be that you needed pre-clearance from the Justice Department to change the rules in one of these southern states that had a history of Jim Crow, that had a history of denying the franchise, the fair vote to African-American citizens. And everyone is upset, along with Citizens United, along with the gun cases like Heller. They're upset about these 5-4 decisions of the Supreme Court that have had such drastic impact. And one of the litany of them is this Shelby. So the fact that Shelby, which cut back on the Voting Rights Act 5-4, has now had this later case which does not cut back, but which actually holds firm to the second most important provision in the Voting Rights Act is very important. Basically, to sum it up, Alabama was going to have about 8 Congress members. It's about 25% black, and yet it only has one minority predominant district and only one district represented by a minority Congress member. This was a redistricting that was going to give it 2 seats, which is much more in conformity with the population. The argument is that, well, they had considered race in making a second minority seat. Well, of course, the act was a remedy, Mark. So you have to consider race. So the dissenters like Alito and Thomas to say, oh my God, you can't consider race. Well, you could consider race as a remedy for what happened in those Jim Crow states that were singled out, you could say, by the Voting Rights Act. But that's where Jim Crow was. That's where the huge problems were. That's where the poll taxes were. That's where the diminution of the rights of black people to vote had been carried out. And so when the Supreme Court cut it back 5-4 several years ago, and there were all the protests over that this Supreme Court, with Roberts and Kavanaugh voting with the 3 moderates to liberals, it's very significant, and it will create a second minority district. So there'll be 2 minority predominant districts in Alabama instead of 1, but that will be in conformity with the population. And to say that it should be done only geographically and not considering race at all is really a farce. It's closing your eyes to the history. The dissenters would have closed their eyes to the history. Kavanaugh and Roberts joined the majority to say you have to consider race as part of the remedy for what happened in those Jim Crow states previously and what the Voting Rights Act intended by Congress.
Fascinating, fascinating. I mean, there are increased attempts across the country. I was going to do the story today. We just don't have time. I'll probably do it next week or sometime soon. Increasing aggressive moves on the part of legislatures nationwide to suppress the vote somehow, to suppress the people's voice. And to give state houses and secretaries of state and governors, this is nationwide, the ability to just decide that the vote doesn't reflect the will of the people. They can literally throw out a vote. That for another time, but I guess this in the same basket of potentially suppressing the people's voice. But you're saying, in this case, the people's voice will prevail.
It will prevail, and I think it's an encouraging sign that Kavanaugh voted with Roberts, because, if Kavanaugh, everybody was watching to see what Kavanaugh did in Dobbs, and if he'd have voted with Roberts and Dobbs, they would have saved a lot of Roe v. Wade. There might have been a 16-week period that the federal constitution would be deemed to protect. Kavanaugh didn't go along with that. Remember, Senator Collins from Maine was like, oh my God, he promised me. But, it may be that Kavanaugh is kind of a one-off on Dobbs. That's bad enough. But if he's going to be a moderate, if he's going to be kind of like a Kennedy, that would be something. I think he's the one who clerked for Kennedy, which is the other irony of the situation. So be another Kennedy, Kavanaugh. Try to stay in the middle, decided on the law, not on ideology. And we're all rooting for you.
Now let's get to Donald Trump and this indictment letter, the target letter. Can you explain what that is and what we know about this so far?
Well, I have so much to say on that, and it's been so fascinating. This is sort of the discussion that we had years ago when everybody was saying, it looks like Trump is going to be indicted. And then, of course, all the people who thought Trump was going to be indicted or so commented or so opined at various stages have sort of looked like, well, they were crying wolf. I don't know what it is about Trump, why he's so lucky or whatever he is, so bombastic that he doesn't get indicted. But now it looks like he's going to be indicted. I think it's really quite clear that it may be in Florida, it may be in federal court in D.C., it may be in both places, but he is going to be indicted in the next few weeks. It looks like the next few weeks over this Mar-a-Lago. And just so people understand Mar-a-Lago, there's been so much that's been happening. It's so interesting. But the gist of it is that when he lost the presidency, instead of leaving the documents in the White House or sending them to the National Archives, he took what he wanted to take with him. And he took a lot of stuff that was very highly classified and had classified markings on it. Then he took it from Washington, D.C., down to the Southern District of Florida, in particular to Mar-a-Lago, where he was, and he stored it all over the place. And it seemed like the things that he really liked, he took into his own private office. He didn't engage in the proper security procedures at all. These highly classified documents have loads of rules and regulations about them. He didn't observe them. It became known either because he showed them to people who then mentioned it to somebody and the feds and the National Archives learned about it, or they looked at the National Archives and said, there are these 5 things that ought to be here. How does it go from 1 to 6? Where are 2 through 4? They're missing. Where are they? The only explanation was that Trump must have taken them. So they got very suspicious. They went to Trump. They said, turn over everything that you have that should go to the National Archives. He delayed them. He obstructed them. Finally, he sent them 15 boxes. When he sent them those 15 boxes, Mark, they had so much stuff that was classified or highly classified. They said, oh my God, what happened here? Even in what he's returning to us, how could he ever have taken stuff like that? So they said to him, do you have any more stuff like this? Because the 15 boxes are just amazing what we're seeing, how much stuff you took that was highly classified. He went around with these lawyers and other aides and he said, okay, there's only 38 things that weren't sent with the 15 boxes. Here are the 38 things. And then when the feds looked at that, they said, this makes no sense at all. We think that we're not getting cooperation. They got authorization for a search. They had to go to a federal magistrate judge who took a hard look at it, authorized the search, that there was probable cause, conducted the search. The FBI went in there. They didn't ballyhoo it. It's Trump who went to the press right away and said, oh my God, I've been searched. Look at what they're doing. If he hadn't made a racket about it, I don't think it would have known. It might have leaked later, but it wouldn't have been the huge ballyhoo that it was last August, you would call.
And he said it was a raid. He said it was an FBI raid. Right.
And just to finish this real quickly, Mark, since then, they want to get to the bottom of what happened. How could this stuff have been taken? How could it have been wrongly retained? And one of the questions is going to be, there's surveillance, which shows who went in and who went out. Now, this is beyond belief, but supposedly, we had a pool leak, we had a flood. Oh my God, and the records are gone. Now, I'm doing this sort of New York mobster impersonation because you think, well, nobody would ever come up with a crazy story like this except Trump this one time. It turns out CNN reported that Trump came up with the same crazy story back in 1998, something like that, when he was being investigated for not having invoices, not having properly paid taxes to New York City or New York State from some hotel that he owned. And guess what his answer was when they could see is either the smoking gun or not the smoking gun? Oh, the smoking gun got drowned in a flood. So now this poor unlucky man has suffered yet another flood. at Mar-a-Lago, and it's destroyed the servers. It's destroyed surveillance tapes of who went in and who went out. The suspicion is that there were these dress rehearsals, and he actually had staff. Trump had his staff down there, some maintenance workers, those kind of folks, sort of practice what access they would give the feds, how they would show the feds around, how they would give the impression that they were seeing everything in the storage room and there was nothing else. And we now know from the search that this was all a bunch of lies. Whether the lawyers connived in the lies or how it happened, it was a bunch of lies. It was a bunch of disinformation because Trump meant to keep the things that he wanted to keep, not turn them over. And when they did the search, there were over 100 documents found with classified markings still on them. And that's the famous Exhibit A that's everyone's seen from the search warrant, which shows a raid around Trump's room, all of these classified documents with the markings still on them. And we've all seen them on that famous photo of the seizures from Trump's room.
Oddly, David, well, first of all, I'll get to the prediction. So obviously, I guess the indictment is imminent because you've got this target letter. Is that what that says? Essentially, hey, your client is going to be indicted?
Yeah, you get a letter like that, unless it's a violent case or a case where they think that the person may imminently flee the country. You get a letter like that in a white-collar case. This is a white-collar case. I've gotten letters like that. I normally do what his lawyers did. Either they got the letter or they were advised a few weeks ago that they were going to get that letter. That's an indication that you can go in and give your side of the story. A lot of times the feds have tried to sort of get your side of the story, but you might have something to add, and it's going to look better later on when you tell the media they didn't even want to hear my side of the story, that the government can say, no, we gave you a chance to come in and tell your side of the story. Now, in 2 of the 3 cases where I presented my side of the story, albeit I didn't have a client like Trump, it was a federal income tax evasion case. But 2 out of the 3 times I managed to persuade the tax division not to indict my client. So I have found that they do have an open mind if you have something really interesting to present. And one thing that was great on Lawrence O'Donnell's show, he had this attorney, this supposedly ex-attorney for Trump, which is a farce. This person, Parlatore, is going around and being Trump's spokesman. No lawyer would go around and hold interviews like that if the client didn't want it, because you have an ongoing duty of loyalty to your client, which includes the fact that you can't just decide that you're going to take, radio and TV appearances and chat about your client's case. So he's got Trump's full authorization. He's basically, left the legal team to go be the PR team. But O'Donnell asked Parlatore, okay, well, have the meeting with me. Tell me what we don't know that would make the government not want to indict Trump in the Mar-a-Lago case. And of course, he talked all around the issue. He never really answered the question. About as close as he came is that there's supposed to be like a presidential reading room that was supposedly set up for other presidents. And they had this nearby reading room that they could go to. And that Trump near Mar-a-Lago didn't have a reading room set up by the government. So he kind of took it upon himself. The implication is to have this self-help of taking and keeping all the documents. Now, this is a ridiculous defense to the extent it's a defense, particularly because Trump has all the money in the world and could have flown up to Washington or New York or wherever the repository was and gone through those records to his heart's content. He could have had copies of them. So they just have nothing to add at all, except that, Trump wants to keep with the whataboutism and what about Hillary, which is a totally different case. And of course, Biden and Pence are utterly different cases because they didn't fail to cooperate. They didn't obstruct. They didn't delay and play games.
It's an odd. Tom is saying Tom is the keeper of ding words, albeit is a ding word. All right, I'll ding it. I think repository is a ding word for sure. Congratulations, always. David has them loaded. He's a learned guy, but he doesn't overwhelm us with them. I wanted to ask you though, even though this indictment is imminent, the breadth of stuff, and this is kind of the way I see it, and just in 30 seconds or less, that we saw this lawless president. Nothing applied to him. No law, no ethical consideration, nothing. His kids couldn't get security clearance. His advisors couldn't get security clearance. He bigfooted it. They were compromised. There was pay to play in all these different ways. So I understand the desire to have him held to account for something, okay? But stay with me. Of the things that are percolating legally, it would seem as though January 6th, the Georgia case. These feel as though they're much bigger deals. And maybe I guess I'm asking you in terms of their effect on American history. You know, you have a president who is trying to manipulate an election. You have a president who is trying to overthrow the transfer of power and to remain in power. It was an insurrection. Those are bigger deals to me than you had a president who took a bunch of classified documents. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that it's not bad. I'm just asking you to evaluate the other cases as well.
Well, I think January 6th is the most serious, and I think that history will note that Merrick Garland should have moved on that he waited around. He would probably say until he had Casey Hutchinson. She was such a critical witness and had so much to say about Meadows and other insiders that if what they're going to do is sort of work up the chain and get Meadows, and you wonder why Meadows testified unless Meadows has made some kind of deal with them. You would think that Meadows, former chief of staff, including on the day of January 6th, you would think that he would have either taken the fifth or he's cooperating with them, which means he's got some kind of deal. So
that's the rumor, right, David, that he's cooperating? Okay.
That's a rumor, but I think it's pretty strong. The amount of time that he spent, the fact that he went in there, he didn't just spend an hour and take the fifth. I think that this fellow who just went into the Miami grand jury the other day, I think when he says, I testified for an hour and I was honest, I think what he honestly did was take the fifth for an hour. He got to take it question by question, and then he left. Because I think he'd be very ill-advised. This was actually a fascinating thing because they had a draft letter, which the special prosecutor has in the Mar-a-Lago case, which said we're turning over everything. The draft that said we've turned over everything, that never went out. That draft got changed so that the letter that went to the special prosecutor didn't say we've turned over everything. Now, everyone who knew why they weren't turning over everything, because they looked in the room and they saw that there were still things that were classified in Trump's desk, because they knew he was playing this game with moving stuff right before the national security official from Justice came to visit Mar-a-Lago with FBI agents. Why was everything not being turned over after a draft said everything had been turned over? Those are critical witnesses. This fellow just called into the grand jury in Miami, seems to know about that. But to go to your point, obviously, January 6th is the most important. I think Trump should have been charged with inciting that riot. They should have gotten the people there that they could get. And I think that, we know that Merrick Garland didn't start for a while because he didn't even assign a special prosecutor to do it until after, Adam Schiff and his committee had done such a fantastic job of unearthing facts that really the Department of Justice has better tools to unearth. They could have threatened people with contempt. They could have indicted lower down people. They had a lot of power that Congress didn't have, and yet Congress had to do that. But I think the second most important one really is Georgia. When you look at it in context, like you're talking about, that could be a federal case too. It doesn't have to be a state case. He was impeding the federal election and trying to get one state to vote the wrong way, send a different slate to count the vote in a way that concocted votes that didn't exist, so that he could steal Georgia, so that he could affect the national count, so that he could assume the national presidency that he'd lost. That's a federal crime too. I agree with you that in the scheme of things, Mar-a-Lago looks like it's the third, but the other two haven't gone anywhere yet. This one looks like it's going to proceed before those two. And if you look at the Espionage Act part of it, if he really did have documents that he used either for his political advantage or worse than that, worse than his economic advantage, for some kind of strategic advantage, some kind of way to play games with Saudi Arabia, to pit them against Iran, to somehow control oil, to get money. If you think about that, that's very serious too, because that's something that happened, and it happened more recently. Whatever you can say about January 6th, and it was awful, it was a failed coup. His efforts that were recorded in Georgia, as strong as that evidence seems to be against him, that was a failed attempt because a Republican Secretary of State stood up to Trump and had the gumption with his lawyer to tape the phone call, which was legal in Georgia. Trump never thought that he'd be recorded saying, hey, find me 11,000 votes that I need to win. Concoct 11,000 votes.
That's right. I forgot that.
I just want to find 11,780.
Yeah, that's all he wants to do is find it. We're all looking for our 11,700. Well, go ahead, Kim, as we wrap up with David.
Yeah, I know we don't have a lot of time left, but I wanted to throw this question at you because I read a story that the governor of California is proposing a 28th Amendment to the Constitution. Did you see this? He says it will permanently enshrine 4 broadly supported gun safety principles. So Governor Gavin Newsom says the amendment would raise the federal minimum age to purchase a firearm from 18 to 21, mandate universal background checks, institute a reasonable waiting period for gun purchases, and ban the civilian purchase of assault weapons. But we all know how hard it is to get a constitutional amendment passed, let alone something that would limit gun restrictions. What do you think? Is this something that you think could actually happen, or is it dreaming?
Ever since we were on with Pat Thurston, Kim, you love to play Stump the Katz. But you're not stumping the Katz because I think as a constitutional amendment, it is so they couldn't get the Equal Rights Amendment through. Think about that, as popular as that was. And so there's no way that they're going to get a constitutional amendment. But I think we can pass laws in California that will withstand a challenge. This idea that the Second Amendment is so restrictive or so actually so entitling that it will be used by this U.S. Supreme Court to knock down state laws on gun control. I think that Newsom ought to, get the political, momentum behind this. He ought to pass these laws and then let the gun manufacturers, that's who's really behind it, take these cases to the federal courts, and let's see if they win. But I think if they're commonsensical, and especially with the amount of mass shootings and other gun violence that there is, don't bet against the Supreme Court. Although if Kavanaugh keeps going this way, he may not get to meet 2 or 4 new Supreme Court justices. He may be the switch in time that saves this 9, right?
Although, let's not read too much into one decision, David. I don't know. Maybe you never know.
Ta-ta.
Yeah, that's right.
I can't give up. I can't
That's
give
a good
up.
word. Come on, ding me.
What's
If you
that?
give up on Kavanaugh, then you have to go with the idea of 11 or 13. Otherwise, these other ones, Gorsuch, Alito, Thomas, even Barrett, they're such lost causes. They're so doctrinaire, so philosophically, religiously, whatever you want to call it, set.
Yeah, well, and I'd love to expand the court, but even that, I guess, is just not going to happen. I mean, I wish the Democrats would lean in more aggressively. But
What are the porn stars doing, Mark?
that, Pat, is maybe for the next time, Pat, please. The magic with you, David, is never ending. Thank you for putting things in kind of a perspective. Your prediction as Katsadamas for the timetable on this indictment is what, sir?
Well, a lot of commentators said it would be a week. I'm not so sure about that anymore because there's this issue of whether they ought to proceed in Florida or D.C. I think they ought to proceed in D.C. Trump was obstructing an investigation from D.C. One last thing, if you got a subpoena and you were in Spain and you obstructed justice, you immediately flushed all the documents that they wanted down the toilet, or you burned them in Spain. You haven't committed a crime in Spain. You've committed a crime where you got the subpoena from. If you got it from D.C., you intended to obstruct justice in D.C. If you got it from L.A. federal court, where I used to be a federal prosecutor, you were obstructing our investigation in Los Angeles. And so the fact that some people may need to be indicted in Florida because they only did things in Florida, like maybe some of these workers, Trump ought to be indicted in D.C. If the case really should be transferred for venue, Trump will make that motion. He'll ask the judge in D.C. to send the venue down to Southern Florida. And if he's right on the law and everything else, then the judge in D.C. will send it to Florida. They ought to indict in D.C. And apparently it's taking them a few weeks to figure that out. So Katsadamas, you want my prediction? I think that the indictment will be in D.C. I may be wrong on that. The other commentators seem to think that I am wrong on that. But I think that's still the smartest way to go. I think that's the way they should go. I think it conforms with the law, no doubt about it. There's huge venue flexibility that the federal government has. They get to file where they want to file. So I think in D.C., but not for a few weeks.
All right. Wow. Good stuff. You can find him here on Thursdays. The great one. Thank you, David Katz, everybody. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.